The first time Ethan saw Clara, it wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't thunder and lightning or fireworks in the sky. It was quieter than that, subtle, like the moment right before dawn breaks. He was sitting at the cafe on Maple Street, one hand wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup of black coffee, the other flipping lazily through a worn copy of Steinbeck's East of Eden. The world around him moved with its usual rhythm. The soft hiss of the espresso machine, the distant bark of a dog, the chatter of baristas and customers blending into a soft urban hum. But then she walked in, and though everything looked the same, something in him shifted. Clara wasn't the kind of beautiful that made heads turn in shock. Hers was the sort of beauty that unfolded slowly, like a melody you don't fully appreciate until it lingers long after it ends. Her auburn hair framed her face in soft waves, her green eyes scanning the menu as if she had all the time in the world. She had the air of someone who belonged in a different era, perhaps the 1950s, where handwritten letters and pressed flowers meant something, and love was more than just swiping right. Ethan didn't speak to her that day. He watched her from behind the safety of his novel, heart thudding louder with every glance she made toward the counter. She ordered a chamomile tea and sat by the window scribbling into a brown leather journal. Her presence was magnetic, not loud but persistent, like the sea carving its shape into the shore. When she left, the bell above the cafe door jingled softly, but to Ethan it sounded like a final note in a song he didn't want to end. He didn't even realize he'd been holding his breath until she was gone. And then, as quickly as she appeared, she became a memory etched in the ordinary. But the universe, in all its quiet chaos, is never done with lovers destined to meet. Fate, or whatever name people give to that invisible hand that pushes strangers into each other's orbit, brought her back into Ethan's life 3 weeks later. It was a rainy Thursday, the kind where the clouds seemed to press down on the city and the streets glistened like ink. Ethan was walking to the bookstore, his coat collar flipped up against the wind, when he nearly collided with her under the awning of a flower shop. She looked up, startled, and their eyes locked. It was as if the rain had paused, holding its breath for them. She smiled sheepishly, brushing wet strands of hair from her face, and Ethan felt the universe slip back into place. "I think I've seen you before," she said, and her voice had the texture of wind chimes. "Maple Street Cafe," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. And just like that, the silence between them bloomed into something more. They started meeting at the cafe every Thursday, each encounter stretching longer than the last. They talked about everything and nothing: books, music, the way people tend to leave just when you start to need them. Ethan learned that Clara was a freelance illustrator, loved rainy days, and believed that every person had a soul season. Hers was autumn, crisp and quiet, and coloured in amber. Clara learned that Ethan was a high school literature teacher, that he reread The Great Gatsby every spring, and that he'd once tried to write poetry but gave up because his emotions felt too big for paper. They spoke like they were rediscovering languages lost in time, and it wasn't long before Thursdays weren't enough. Soon, they were spending weekends together, visiting bookstores, getting lost in museums, wandering through parks where the trees whispered secrets only they could hear. Ethan didn't know when he fell in love with her. Maybe it was the night she fell asleep on his shoulder during an old movie marathon, or the morning she made him pancakes shaped like stars and said, "You make the world feel magical." Maybe it was when she cried in front of him, not out of sadness but out of trust, because she believed he wouldn't run. All he knew was that with Clara, life felt fuller, deeper, as if colours were more vivid and time more precious. They fit in ways that made sense without needing explanation, like how her hand always found his in crowded rooms, or how he knew she liked 3 sugars in her tea even before she said it. Loving her was like reading a book he never wanted to end. But love, true, soul-deep love, is never without its shadows. Clara's health had always been fragile, something she'd brushed off with a shrug and a soft smile. She called them her spells, moments when her body would grow weak and her world would tilt, forcing her to lie still for hours. Ethan didn't ask too many questions at first, respecting the veil of privacy she wore like silk. But as their love grew, so did his concern. One evening, after she collapsed in his arms at the park, he insisted on going with her to the doctor. That was when the word lupus entered their vocabulary, an autoimmune disease that would shape the contours of their future. Clara handled the diagnosis with her usual grace, making jokes to ease the weight in Ethan's eyes. But he saw the pain she tried to hide, the fatigue, the medications, the uncertainty of what each day would bring. Still, they loved each other fiercely. They made a home together, small but warm, filled with art prints, paperbacks, and quiet joy. They built routines out of rituals. Sunday mornings with jazz records and pancakes, Thursday cafe dates that never lost their magic, evenings spent curled up with their favourite stories. They talked about getting married someday, maybe adopting a dog named Fitzgerald, maybe moving to a cottage by the lake. Ethan never doubted for a moment that he'd grow old with Clara, even if the road would be harder. They were writing a love story not in grand gestures, but in everyday devotion, caring for one another, choosing each other over and over again. But time, as it always does, began to tug at the seams of their perfect world. Clara's condition grew more unpredictable. Some days she'd wake up with trembling hands and eyes that couldn't hide the pain, no matter how brightly she smiled. Other days she'd be the radiant soul Ethan first fell in love with, laughing at his bad jokes, dancing barefoot in the living room, sketching wildflowers in her journal. But in between those days were the harder ones, when the medicine wasn't enough, when she could barely move, when Ethan would sit beside her bed for hours reading aloud just to keep the silence from suffocating them. He never once considered leaving. To him, loving Clara wasn't just about joy, it was about presence. It was about staying even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Ethan began to learn her language of pain, how her fingers twitched slightly when she was on the verge of a flare-up, how she'd tap her cup twice when she didn't want to talk about how bad it really was. He became her caregiver as much as her partner, though he never saw it as a burden. He saw it as an honor, a quiet vow he renewed each day. He adapted his life around her needs, adjusted his school schedule when necessary, became a student of her rhythms. And Clara, for all the suffering her illness caused, never let it define her. "I am not my diagnosis," she would say, her voice firm even when her body wasn't. "I'm still me, I'm still yours." And she was. Every broken piece, every unspoken fear, every fragile heartbeat, she was his, and he was hers. They made love like it was the last time, every time. Not out of desperation, but out of reverence. Clara would run her fingers along Ethan's spine as if mapping constellations, memorizing the galaxy of scars and softness that made up the man she adored. Ethan would whisper poetry into the curve of her neck, promising in verses of longing. In their quietest moments, they didn't speak. They breathed each other in, held each other like lifelines. They planned a wedding not for the spectacle, but for the vow. Just them, a few friends, a garden in spring. Clara wore a pale lavender dress and a crown of baby's breath. Ethan cried the moment she walked toward him. He had seen her at her strongest and her weakest, and yet, in that moment, she looked immortal. She promised to love him with whatever days she had left. He promised to never waste a single one. The years that followed were both cruel and beautiful. There were hospital stays and emergency rooms, days spent tangled in IV cords and hushed conversations with specialists. But there were also sunlit breakfasts on the balcony, surprise anniversary picnics in the living room, midnight drives to nowhere just to feel the wind. Clara never stopped drawing. Her art became more abstract, more emotional, like she was trying to capture the ache and awe of existence all at once. Ethan supported her with unwavering devotion, cheering her on, helping her sell prints online, framing her best pieces for their home. Their love wasn't cinematic. It was intimate, earned, real. It was the kind of love you carry even after the body is gone. Then came the morning when Clara didn't wake up. She had been growing weaker for weeks, but she kept smiling, kept saying things like, "I just need more sleep," or "It's the weather." But Ethan knew. He felt the slow fading of her soul, like watching candlelight dim in a storm. That night she asked him to hold her tighter. She whispered, "Thank you for choosing me, even when I'm a mess." And he kissed her forehead and said, "In every life I'd find you again." She fell asleep in his arms, the way she had so many times before, But this time she didn't stir when the sun broke through the curtains. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't panic. He just held her closer, his tears falling silently into her hair, and whispered, "Wait for me." It was both a goodbye and a promise. The funeral was small, as she'd wanted. Her favourite paintings were displayed around the room, her lavender dress draped over the casket like a second skin. Ethan spoke with a voice steady from grief, not absence. "Clara didn't lose to illness," he said. "She lived, fully, bravely. And she taught me that love isn't about how long you have, it's about how deeply you feel in the time you're given." And though his heart was shattered beyond recognition, he stood tall, for her. Because she had loved him into the strongest version of himself. And yet the hardest part came after: the quiet, the silence in the home they built, the smell of her shampoo lingering in the bathroom, the half-finished sketch on the desk, the teacup still sitting on the window ledge, kissed with a faint lipstick stain. Grief wasn't loud. It was a dull throb that followed Ethan everywhere. People said he was strong, that time would heal, but they didn't understand. He didn't want to heal. He didn't want to move on. He just wanted her back. He would have traded everything, his job, his breath, the sun, for one more Thursday at the cafe with her smile across the table. Every night he would sit on the edge of their bed and write her letters. Pages and pages of unsent love, chronicling his days, his dreams, his pain. "I hope the stars are treating you well," he'd write. "I hope you still dance in the rain." It was his way of keeping her close, of telling the universe that love, real love, doesn't end when the heart stops beating. It becomes something else, an echo, a vow, a tether across time. In the years that followed, Ethan continued on, but he was never truly whole. He existed like a photograph left out in the sun, faded around the edges, the colour of life slowly seeping from his spirit. He taught his students with warmth, always making sure to include Clara's favourite poems in the curriculum. Emily Dickinson's "Because I Could Not Stop for Death" always made his voice crack. He still went to the Maple Street Cafe every Thursday, sitting at their old table by the window, ordering 2 drinks, his black coffee and her chamomile tea. He never touched the second cup. It sat there, steaming quietly, as if waiting for her to return. The baristas eventually stopped asking why. They knew, everyone in the neighbourhood knew, he had become something of a legend. The man who loved once and forever. He travelled sometimes, carrying her journal and sketches in a worn leather satchel. He'd sit by lakes or in cathedrals, flipping through pages of her delicate art, each stroke a fingerprint of her soul. In Venice, he left a flower on a stranger's balcony, because Clara had always wanted to visit the city of masks. In Kyoto, he lit incense for her spirit and watched the smoke rise like her laughter. In a small Scottish inn, he told the innkeeper that he was just passing through, but stayed for a week because the way the hills rolled reminded him of how she used to sketch her dreams. And though he saw the world, every place was haunted with her absence. Beauty had become bittersweet, a painting missing its final brushstroke. But as the years wore on, the pain softened. Not because it lessened, but because he had learned to carry it like a sacred relic. Grief had not broken him. It had transformed him. It taught him to love strangers more gently, to cherish silence more deeply, to never let a day pass without saying what mattered. He mentored students who were lost, sat with old friends through their own losses, and sometimes when the wind was just right, he'd talk to her out loud like she was walking beside him. "Can you see the sky tonight, Clara? It's the same shade as your eyes when you cried at our wedding." And in those moments, he didn't feel quite so alone. On the anniversary of her death each year, he would take her old art journal to the hill where they once lay under the stars and read aloud the letter he wrote her that year. It became a ritual, a conversation across worlds. In one letter, he wrote, "I still feel you in my dreams. Sometimes I see you laughing in a sun-drenched kitchen or running through fields in a white dress, and I always wake up crying, not out of sorrow, but because you still feel so close. Maybe that's what heaven is, Clara, a place where the ache is gone, but the love remains." And in those quiet hilltop moments beneath an open sky, he began to believe that love was bigger than time, that somewhere in the architecture of the universe, she was waiting for him. Then one night, much older now, Ethan fell asleep in his armchair with Clara's journal resting on his chest. The rain tapped softly at the windows, the fire hissed in its slow death, and the world held its breath. His breathing grew shallower, like the tides slowly receding. In his final dream, he saw her. Not sick, not fragile, but radiant, standing in a field of lavender with her hair lifted by the wind. She smiled, and the years melted away. She opened her arms, and Ethan walked into them like he was returning home. "I missed you," he whispered, burying his face in her neck. "I waited," she said, holding him tighter than the years had allowed, and the stars pulsed brighter. In another life, perhaps the one that began with that dream, they were strangers once again. A bookstore in Prague, a crowded train in Paris, a classroom in some small town. But the eyes are timeless. And when Ethan saw Clara across a new room in a new world, something in his soul flared awake. He didn't know her name yet, she didn't know his story, but they smiled, just a little too long, and something deep within them whispered, "There you are," and love, like it always does with soulmates, began again. Because that's the truth no time or illness can erase. When love is real, it transcends endings. It moves through death like light through a window. It finds us again and again, and in another life and every life after, Ethan would still choose Clara.